This is the second of two guest lectures to be given on the 2018 Economic Policy Analysis 3 course at the University of Adelaide by Associate Professor Philip Lorne. Phil is Senior Research Fellow at the Centre of Full Employment and Equity at the University of Newcastle. He is also a Research Fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and a member of the Wakefield Futures Group in South Australia. As some of you know, he is also a current visiting lecturer in the School of Economics at this university. He's the author or editor of 8 books, along with 55 journal articles and more than 40 book chapters. His most recent book was Resolving the Climate Change Crisis, The Ecological Economics of Climate Change, published by Springer in 2016, which is a core text on the climate change course at this university. He is currently engaged in the major project of developing genuine progress indicator accounts for virtually every country in the world on a comparable basis. This second lecture is on the topic of the Genuine Progress Indicator, a measure of economic progress which is rapidly becoming more widely discussed, of which Phil is one of the world's leading developers and advocates. So I'll just hand you over to Phil.
Is that working? Is that working? Yeah. Okay, yeah, as Steve said, I'm going to talk today about the Genuine Progress Indicator. I'm sure I mentioned it last Thursday in the first lecture I gave. I'll just reiterate some of the things that I said last week when I talked a little bit about ecological macroeconomics, and I pointed out that economic welfare at the macro level is basically equal to the sum of the benefits and minus the sum of the cost of economic activity at the macroeconomic level. And I talked a bit about the notion of an optimal macroeconomic scale. So as the scale of the economy, physical scale of the economy grows, we move along the horizontal axis, the benefits or uncancelled benefits, and I'll talk a little bit about that before I talk about the GPI, go up at a diminishing rate in accordance with the principle of diminishing marginal benefits. The costs or uncancelled costs go up at an increasing rate, but we have a vertical line drawn for the uncancelled cost curve at a scale which we might call the maximum sustainable scale. And any scale of the economy between 0 and SS, the maximum sustainable scale, is an economy that can be maintained by resources or generates waste that's within the regenerative and waste assimilative capacity of the natural environment, and in that sense does not violate some of the sustainability precepts that I talked about last week. So it means we've got a scale S which is less than or equal to SS, but of course only one of those scales is the optimal scale, and that of course is S star, and that's where sustainable economic welfare is maximised. That's the vertical difference or difference between the uncancelled benefits and uncancelled costs of economic activity at a given scale, and that's maximised where the marginal benefit of growth is equal to the marginal cost of growth. Well, I talked of, and I'll just put it up again, something in relation to this maximum sustainable scale, and that's an ecological footprint indicator. The dotted line represents, so this at the global level, the Earth's ecological capacity or biocapacity. This sort of reddy brown sort of line represents humanity's ecological footprint, and you can see that around about, well, at least according to this figure, that the ecological footprint at the global level exceeded biocapacity, which is one Earth, in 1985, suggesting the global economy has gone beyond the maximum sustainable scale. This has been updated. This is quite old, as you can see. It only goes to 2001, and in fact this is much higher, and I think the ecological footprint exceeds global biocapacity around about early 1970s. So it was earlier than 1985, and currently we're at about 1.7 Earths. Just go back. All right. So A little bit about these uncancelled benefits, uncancelled costs and sustainable economic welfare. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I put something similar to this up last week, and I talked about the fact that here we have resources which are used to produce goods and services. The production process is, and the consumption process, they're both resource transforming processes. Production adds value, whereas consumption destroys value. So here you've got capital and labour, or human-made capital and labour applied to the resources. Let's say it's 100 units of matter and energy with use value, let's say 10 utils, very limited in their natural form. And let's assume that applying capital and labour to those resources, we produce goods and services which would also include human-made capital. We don't just produce consumer goods, which we can call Q, let's say equal to 50 units of matter and energy, and I pointed out that would mean that the technical efficiency of production would be 50%. Let's assume that through production we add 60 utils, right, by being a value-adding process production. We start with 10 utils and we have 70. We'll assume because the technical efficiency of production is 50%, that 50 units of matter and energy immediately become waste, which of course has 0 utils, and of course consumption is a value-destroying process, so the 70 utils, which is the 60 utils added to the 10 initial utils, are destroyed through consumption. Although consumption annihilates or eliminates the utils, of course we need to consume the goods and services to enjoy the utils or the use value that's added in production. And of course eventually the goods and services are either directly consumed if they're non-durable goods, or they're worn out through use if they're durable goods, and of course they become waste as well. The level of waste, or the quantity of waste, 100 units of matter and energy having to equal the quantity of matter and energy embodied in the resources that were initially used, because of the first law of thermodynamics. And because of the second law, that E, value for E, there's always going to be some waste, has to be less than 100%. Okay? So, net psychic income. But just think of psychic income as equivalent to utility. Okay, it's a term that ecological economists quite often use. Think of net psychic income equal to psychic income minus psychic outgo, which would be things that would lead to disutility, the disutility of the production process. We have 70 utils, which are the uncancelled benefits, minus which would be the psychic income, the 20 utils, disutility. I'm assuming that the production process and so forth results in 20 units or units of disutility, which might include some social costs, which I'll talk about, which are included in the GPI, such as the cost of crime, the cost of unemployment. All right, so not all this labour that might be applied in production, that might not consist of all the labour force, so we have unemployment and so forth. So the net psychic income is basically equal to the economic benefits minus social costs. Okay, that gives us a net psychic income. And the lost natural capital services, which are the environmental costs, that's basically the value of the resources, the use value that's in fact just naturally embodied in the resources, which of course we forego, plus any waste level that exceeds the ability of the natural environment to assimilate those wastes is going to incur further costs. So I've assumed, say, 10 utils in both cases, so the uncancelled cost of economic activity would be the 10 utils foregone in terms of resources and 10 utils foregone in terms of a depletion of the environment's sink capacity, so that's 20 utils foregone. So sustainable economic welfare is basically equal to net psychic income minus lost natural capital services, which is uncancelled benefits minus uncancelled costs, which is 50 minus 20, which is about 30 utils, and that would be the value of the GPI. Okay, a little bit about the GPI. So clearly the GPI is an attempt at measuring sustainable economic welfare at the macroeconomic level. And of course it treats negative welfare consequences as costs and positive activities as benefits, unlike GDP, which adds everything good or bad. So any form of economic activity is just added. There's no subtraction. The GPI does not include welfare maintaining activities. So part of what we do, part of the GDP, is designed to maintain our welfare. That's not included in the GPI. It's only welfare increasing activities that are included in the GPI. And these welfare maintaining activities are sometimes referred to as defensive and rehabilitative expenditures. All right, so think of the Netherlands with climate change and average global temperatures rising, sea levels expected to rise. Well, the Netherlands only exists because of dikes that prevent the seawater from inundating the country. Most of it's below sea level. Well, as the sea level rises, part of the GDP in the future is going to be allocated to or consist of raising the dike walls to prevent the seawater from inundating the Netherlands. Well, that's not a welfare increasing activity, that's a welfare maintaining activity. All right, it's part of the GDP because GDP is a measure of production, as I'll talk about soon, but it's not part of the GPI because they're not adding to the well-being of people in the Netherlands. It would be just maintaining it. The GPI includes things that the GDP does not, like unpaid household labour, the shadow economy, the welfare effect of changing inequality over time and the cost of unemployment. So that's some of the disutility aspects, social costs that I was talking about, although some of the economic benefits which GDP does not capture, such as production in the household that's unpaid for. It's important to note a lot of people think the GPI is an attempt at measuring sustainability. It's not an indicator of sustainability. Includes a lot of environmental costs, but includes those costs because as costs, they impact negatively on our well-being. And separate ecological indicators are required to determine where the economy is in relation to the maximum sustainable scale. That was SS, which the ecological footprint is probably the best of all the indicators that are currently available. All right, a little bit more about the GPI. One way to look at the GPI is, because I'm going to put up a diagram comparing the GPI with GDP for the USA, is to look at GDP and what makes up GDP and consider how the GPI, or the calculation of the GPI, treats these particular values. So using the expenditure approach to calculate GDP, of course, it's just C plus I plus G plus X minus M. You're probably familiar with that, which is just, now of course GDP is just a monetary measure of production. Perhaps I should have put that in italics, production, because that's a key point. It's just a measure of production. Now, one of the peculiar things about, if you go to the national accounts, is that, so I've got consumption, that's private sector, investment private sector. For some reason, they just lump government consumption expenditure and government investment expenditure together and call it G. So I've split it up, okay, to government consumption and government investment expenditure plus X minus M. Okay, let's consider the first item here, which is private sector consumption. Now, of course, the GPI only includes consumption that is non-defensive or rehabilitative, okay? Unlike the GDP, which counts all goods and services produced as part of the GDP. Now, let's think about expenditure on domestically produced non-durable consumption goods. So let's think of you walk into a restaurant and you have a meal, a couple of glasses of wine, perhaps an entree or what have you, and it costs you $50. Well, that would be expenditure on domestically produced non-durable consumption goods, and basically that $50 in the GPI would be equivalent to the welfare enjoyed from the consumption of the domestically produced non-durable consumption goods, in this case a meal at a restaurant. That would be included in this year's GPI. Okay, so it's included in the GPI. It also would be included in this year's GDP, but of course GDP goes a bit further and includes those goods and services that are produced for defensive and rehabilitative reasons. The GPI doesn't. Now consider expenditure on foreign produced non-durable consumption goods, imports. Again, the GPI includes this, counts this, because if you purchase an imported product, a non-durable imported product, you still enjoy benefits from that. Okay, so again, the amount that you spend on that imported non-durable consumption good is treated as the dollar value of the welfare enjoyed from consuming that particular good. So it's included in this year's GPI. It's not included in GDP because it's an import. Remember, GDP is a measure of production, so this M just represents components of this which are imported. Instead of subtracting it from each of these, you just lump all the imports together in order to calculate GDP. So imported goods, they're not produced domestically, they're not included in the GDP, but of course any imported good that you, non-durable consumption good that you purchase, you get enjoyment from it, as to your welfare. So it's included in the GPI but not in the GDP. Okay, then there's expenditure on domestically produced durable consumption goods. So this is different to what I've talked about here, where I'm talking about non-durable consumption goods. Just adds to the existing stock of durable consumption goods, does not add to current welfare but future welfare. All right, so let's imagine that you have, I was trying to think this morning of an Australian-made domestically produced durable consumption good. There aren't many these days. Once upon a time I could have said refrigerators and washing machines and so forth. I did think of one, but I've forgotten it now. Let's say, I'm sure there's some sort of clothing item which is shoes that are still being produced in Australia. That's a durable item, okay? It's not as if you purchase shoes and you wear them once and you throw them out because they're completely ruined. So it's a durable consumption good. Well, any included here will be expenditure on domestically produced durable consumption goods that's not included in the GPI, the current measure of GPI for this particular year, but is included in future years. The reason being is that it's assumed that when you purchase durable consumption goods, you're just adding in the present, you're just adding to the stock, and then, of course, you use those goods over time and you enjoy the benefits from them. So if you go into a shop and buy a pair of shoes made in Australia and they cost you $200, you don't get an immediate $200 benefit. If those shoes last you 5 years, you'll get approximately $40 of benefit over the next 5 years. Okay? Whereas GDP is only interested in production. If they've been produced and purchased this particular year, they'll be included in the GDP. And of course, how will it be this be included in the GPI? Well, it's not included in this year's GPI, but we included in next year's GPI, because as I'm about to say, that the depreciation of the existing stock of consumer durables provides services in the future. So it's picked up in the GPI in future years. Okay. So then there's expenditure on foreign produced durable consumption goods, imports. Again, that just adds to the existing stock of durable consumption goods, does not add to current welfare. It's, for the same reason, not included in this year's GPI, but it's included in next year's GPI. So if you buy, a television that's been manufactured in China, okay, costs you $1,000, you don't get an immediate $1,000 benefit, you're just adding to the stock of consumer durables that you and the nation possesses, which provides services in the future. Okay. It would not be included in GDP either, because it would be an imported product. Then there's the depreciation of the existing stock of consumer durables, domestic and foreign produced. It doesn't matter when you're talking about the GPI. Adds to current, to current welfare, that should say. Shouldn't have value there, to current welfare. So think of this. At the beginning of a particular year, you've got a stock of consumer durables, which you'll be using during the year, which will provide services. That's added in the case of the GPI. Any new durable consumption goods purchased are not counted. They're not included in the GPI because they're just adding to the stock of consumer durables, some of which you're wearing out whilst you're using them in the current year. Right, this depreciation, that's basically, so what's done usually with the GPI is there is an assumption that the average consumer durable lasts for 10 years. I think it's 10 years. And you just keep, maintain a running value for the stock of consumer durables over time, and you just multiply it by 10%, which is the depreciation value, which is sort of like, in inverted commas, equivalent to consuming the stock of consumer durables. So, you know, if it's the value of the stock of consumer durables for Australia at the beginning of the year is, say, $100 billion, and we assume that the stock of consumer durables is wearing out at the rate of 10% per year, then that would be 100 billion times 10%, 10 billion. So you get $10 billion of services which would be included in the GPI. Okay? But any expenditure, current expenditure on consumer durables would not. Now, in the case of, in this particular case, whether the products are domestic or foreign produced is irrelevant. Whether the TV set's made domestically or it's a foreign produced TV is irrelevant. Okay, it doesn't matter. You still get the same benefits from a TV over time, whether it's made in Australia or if it's made overseas. It's not included in the GDP, of course, for two reasons. Well, firstly, any foreign produced goods are not going to be included. And of course, GDP only includes what you've been produced and purchased this particular year. So we're not enjoying, according to GDP, when I say according to GDP, if you're using GDP as a measure of well-being, because really GDP is an ideal indicator of production, but it's not an ideal indicator of well-being, it would mean that any consumer durables that would be included in this room, we are not enjoying the benefits of, right? Because they were produced in the past. They would have been part of GDP in the past, but not part of our welfare at present. The GPI would include the services being provided by consumer durables we have at present. So basically what happens is that this particular item here, we can call this adjusted consumption. So that's private sector consumption. We subtract expenditure on consumer durables, because that's just adding to the stock of consumer durables, and we add the services from the existing consumer durables. And one of the reasons for that, I talked about the fact that expenditure on consumer goods and consumption are two different things. Economists generally treat the two as the same. Right? Consumption is the destruction of goods, either directly, if it's food, or indirectly by wearing something out, and the benefits that are generated through the destruction of goods and services. Expenditure on consumer goods, of course, just simply means that consumer goods that are being purchased, whether they're being consumed in the present or not. And that adjusted measure of consumption is weighted in line with changes in the distribution of income, on the basis that the marginal benefit of consumption for the poor is higher than it is for the rich. All right, so an extra $10 of consumption for the poorest person in Australia is going to add more to that person's well-being than an extra $10 of consumption for Australia's richest person. So if, let's just say that adjusted measure of consumption was the same 2 years straight, but the income was distributed more unequally from 1 year to the next, then that would be weighted down. If it's more equal, it's weighted up. Okay, let's think of the next one, private sector investment. So let's think of expenditure on domestically produced capital goods. That just adds to the existing stock of capital goods, does not increase current welfare. So if a firm buys a machine that's made in Australia in the present, it's just adding to the stock of machines that are available to produce consumer goods in the future. So it adds to future welfare by way of future consumption. Right? Those capital goods that have been produced and purchased and acquired today are just adding to the stock, that they're not adding to our well-being today, but they'll be used to produce consumption goods in the future, so they'll add to our future well-being. So it's not included in this year's GDP, but it's included in next year's GPI, included in next year's GPI in the form of consumption benefits. Of course, it's included in GDP, right, because it's a form of production. Expenditure on foreign produced capital goods adds to existing stock of capital goods, just like domestically produced capital goods. Does not increase current welfare for the same reason, adds to future welfare by way of future consumption. So it's not going to be included in this year's GPI, but it's going to be included in next year's GPI. It's not included in GDP at all because they're imports. They're not produced here. Now think of government consumption, expenditure. What's the difference between government consumption expenditure and investment expenditure? Let's think of the area of health. If you go to a public hospital, the pharmaceuticals that you might be consuming, they would be a form of government consumption. But if at the same time you're in the hospital, you can hear a lot of noise because another ward's being added to the hospital, that would be a form of government investment expenditure. So government consumption expenditure is, of course, for the GPI, again, it only includes non-defensive, non-rehabilitative forms of consumption. It's treated basically the same way as private sector consumption. But there is a difference. The adjusted consumption, government spending, is not weighted in line with changes in the distribution of income. Right? So it's assumed that private sector household consumption, it depends, and the distribution of consumption depends upon the distribution of income, but who gets to consume government consumption goods, government-provided consumption goods, it's assumed income is irrelevant. So there's no weighting. Okay, so then there's a government investment. Again, in terms of the GPI, only non-defensive, non-rehabilitative forms of investment are counted. So let's consider expenditure on domestically built capital goods. We'll call that infrastructure. Adds to the existing stock of infrastructure. It's a bit like consumer durables. Does not increase current welfare. Okay, so I don't know, is there something being built on the Adelaide Uni campus at present? That's not adding to the well-being of anyone at present. Okay, it won't be until it's finished and then people start using that particular facility. This was built many years ago, this lecture theatre. We're enjoying the benefits of it now. All right, when it was being built, it didn't increase our well-being, so it's not part of the GPI. It's now a part of the GPI, the services provided by this lecture theatre. So it's not included in this year's GPI, it's included in next year's GPI and beyond. Not in terms of, obviously, we're not talking about consumption goods here, we're talking about infrastructure. The same sort of approach is applied. Generally with the GPI, the assumption is that infrastructure wears out at the rate of 5% per year. So an average piece of component of the public infrastructure lasts 20 years. So whatever the value of the existing stock of infrastructure is at the beginning of the year, multiply that by 5%, and that's the services provided by currently existing infrastructure, which is added in the case of the GPI. But any spending by government, investment spending on infrastructure in the present is not included in the GPI because it's just adding to the stock of infrastructure. Now, of course, in terms of the GDP, that will be included in this year's GDP because it's being produced today and it's domestically built. Expenditure on foreign-produced capital goods, it will infrastructure, again adds to existing stock of infrastructure, does not increase current welfare, but again adds to future welfare by way of future infrastructural services. So it's not included in this year's GPI, included in next year's GPI, so much the same as this one here. The difference being, of course, this is included in GDP because it was domestically produced, and this being foreign produced, it's not included in GDP. The reason why this distinction is important is because exports are quite often considered a benefit and imports a cost because there is too much of a focus on GDP as a measure of well-being. And because exports increase GDP, it's assumed that that's a benefit. Well, in actual fact, exports are a cost. Exports are things that a nation produces from its scarce resources and gives to the rest of the world to consume and use. That's no benefit to you. Okay, you might acquire financial assets denominated in the currency of the countries that you're exporting to, but they're just pieces of paper, basically. Whereas imports are benefit. Okay, imports are goods that other countries have produced using their scarce resources that they're giving to us to consume or use. Okay, so the GPI doesn't make any distinction between domestically or foreign-produced goods, whether they be consumption goods or infrastructural goods and so forth. So exports, yeah, well, I guess I've really talked about that. Expenditure by foreigners on domestically produced goods does not increase domestic welfare, so it adds to welfare of foreigners. It's not included in the GPI. Any of these goods here that are part of GDP because they're produced domestically are not included in the GPI because they're enjoyed by people elsewhere, not by us. Whereas imports, where relevant, well, of course, That X is included in GDP. In terms of imports, expenditure on imports increases welfare where relevant. Okay, where they're non-defensive, non-rehabilitative, if they're consumer durables, whether it's or non-durables now, durables into the future. And of course, they're not included in the GDP because they're not produced domestically. Then after you've done that, there's a series of social benefits and costs that are added and subtracted, like the value of household labour, cost of crime, cost of unemployment, cost of family breakdown and so forth. And then a series of environmental costs are subtracted. So the methodology, well, most GPI studies include around about 25 benefit and cost items of the economic, social, and environmental variety. Here's a list of some typical economic benefits, which you might call psychic income that I talked about before. Household consumption, less expenditure on consumer durables. Remember, we subtract that because it's only adding to the stock of consumer durables. Plus services from existing stock of consumer durables. Then it's adjusted, this adjusted measure of household private sector consumption is weighed in line with changes in the distribution of income. Then there's the government consumption expenditure, infrastructural services, right, the services provided by the existing stock of infrastructure, shadow economy. Now, in my recent calculations, I'm including this. I don't believe this has been included in the GPI before. Household labour has. You could argue that household labour is part of the shadow economy, but the recent studies that I'm doing is including the value of the shadow economy. Change in net international investment position. Now, this, if it goes up or down, is treated either as positively or negatively with the GPI, but it only includes private sector debt. If it's central government debt, it's not counted because the central government is assuming it's a currency issuing central government, is able to redeem the value of any debt that it might issue to foreigners who have purchased, or of which we purchased products or imported products from, and so is not counted. Non-welfare increasing defence spending, by defence I'm talking about military spending, and non-welfare increasing. You could argue that some defence spending is beneficial. In the defence budget will be spending on food for military personnel. Well, obviously that's a benefit to them. And some of the things that are built, some roads, bridges or what have you, by the military actually serve useful civilian purposes. So only the non-welfare increasing defence spending is subtracted, which is the majority of it. Then you've got the social costs, the psychic outgo. Ooh, that shouldn't be there, that one. Sorry, unpaid household labour, that should not be there, that one. You've got a series of costs, cost of unemployment and underemployment, cost of crime, family breakdown, overwork. There are a couple of others that can be included, so this is not exhaustive, this list. Then you've got your environmental costs, the lost natural capital services, which were they were the uncancelled costs, and just some of those that might be included: non-renewable resource depletion, land degradation, excessive water use, deforestation, air pollution, industrial wastewater pollution, and CO2 emissions. Okay, this is. I posted this in it, or pasted this in, sorry, and it came up like that. Sometimes putting Excel spreadsheets into PowerPoint just do some weird things. But anyway, this is probably going to have to be updated. Well, it is going to be updated. This is a genuine progress indicator study I did for Australia. I think it was from about 1962 to 2010. This is just looking at 1 year. All right, so this just gives you some idea of the various items. So here's our uncancelled benefits account. So that's representing that cancelled benefits curve for a particular year. The psychic income items are the economic benefits, private consumption and services from consumer durables. Then there's an index of income distribution to weight that. Remember, we weighted that according to changes in the distribution of income. Public consumption expenditure, benefits yielded by public infrastructure, services provided by non-paid household labour. There's a few boo-boos here. Services provided by volunteer labour, so sometimes volunteer labour is included. That gives us our total psychic income. Then our psychic outgo items, defensive and rehabilitative expenditures. It could have been placed in here, but it's being sort of a cost, something you subtract. I've put it in the psychic outgo account. Cost of unemployment, crime, family breakdown, overwork, and so forth, the foreign debt, gives us, excuse me, the total psychic outgo. So here we've got, here's the psychic income for Australia, which is about $1 trillion in 2010. That's the psychic income, that's the psychic outgo. So there's the net psychic income, 752 billion. 752 billion. Yes, that's right. And here's our uncancelled costs account. So there's just all these environmental costs. Now, I've categorised them because ecological economists talk about lost natural capital services in terms of the loss of three particular functions served by the natural environment. That is the source function, that's providing a source of resources. So all the resource depletion sort of costs are in there. This is the lost sink function, which is due to excessive waste generation. So various forms of pollution. And then there's the life support function, which I've got cost of lost wetlands and cost of long-term environmental damage, which is related to CO2 emissions and so forth. All right, you add them all up and you get your lost natural capital services. Now, when I did this particular study, I did weight that according to, I managed to produce an ecosystem health index, which I then used to weight the lost natural capital services. The reason for that was, let's take, for example, mining. Okay, there's basically two ways you can mine. You can go underground, or it can be open cut. Let's say it's open cut, then it might be a pristine area. Okay, you lose that ecosystem. Okay, if you go underground, you can still maintain it. All right, so the ecosystem health index was based effectively on the area of remnant vegetation in Australia, and of course so the first year it was a value of 162. By 2010 it was 88, so it had fallen, the value of the index, so that weights these costs up. Right, takes into account the ecological, the extended ecological effect. So here's our uncancelled costs. Remember the uncancelled benefits was about 752 billion. Subtract that from the 7, and there's the GPI, 580 billion. Australia's population at the time, that's thousands of people, was 22 million. So it was about $26,309 per person, the per capita GPI. Yep.
Can I ask questions now?
Haven't got much. Okay, because I'm just going to put up some results now. I'm, as Stephen pointed out, I'm doing GPI studies, trying to do it. The plan is for every country on Earth. Not much fun. This is not a fun thing to calculate. And here's the one that I'm reasonably happy with at this stage. I've calculated a number of them, but I still need to adjust them, modify them a bit, and then I've got to do every country. So this is the USA. The red line is USA's per capita GDP, and the blue line is the per capita GPI. And you can see that the per capita GPI is substantially less than per capita GDP and is not growing at the same rate. This pink line is average life expectancy. I've got that in there because I may be part of a study which looks at, which is generally what's done is that it's assumed that per capita GDP is a good indicator of life expectancy. So the idea of this study is not only to calculate the per capita or the GPI for each country, but to see whether or not that's a better indicator or predictor of average life expectancy than per capita GDP. And I'll talk about that right at the end. So if we just set them all at an index value of 100, you get an idea of the comparative change in per capita GDP and per capita GPI. Then there's the components. So the black line is the per capita GPI. The blue line is per capita economic benefits. So they're rising. The economic benefits on a per capita basis are still rising. Per capita social net benefits are declining, and the per capita lost natural capital services being costs, some of all these costs are negative, is also increasing. You can also set them at an index value to get some idea of what's happening to them in a relative sense. Now, what else I'm going to try and do for each country is I'm going to try and work out the per person GPI of each income quintile. So the top 20%, second, middle, fourth and bottom. And so that's the per person GPI of the richest 20% in the USA. And here it is for the bottom. And the interesting thing about those in the bottom quintiles, you can see that basically over the period, the per capita, that's 1970 to 2016, by the way, the person GPI of the bottom quintile didn't increase at all. It's about the same. And in fact, well, apart from here, around this early years of the study period, in general, it went below and then recovered, below and recovered. But it indicates the vulnerability of the people in the lower income or lowest income quintile. Just to give you some idea of how else the GPI can indicate the welfare effect of economic policies and environmental social policies that aren't properly reflected by per capita GDP. This is a bit of a crude estimate at this stage. I've got to modify this one, but this is the per capita GDP versus per capita GPI of Saudi Arabia. Per capita GDP in Saudi Arabia in the 1970s was about the highest in the world, and that was because of the very high oil prices. Right, there was the oil price spikes in 1973 and 1979. Of course, that settled down a bit. It's still reasonably high, but you can see that the per capita GPI is not nearly as high, and it's fluctuated quite considerably. And in fact, if you look at the individual quintiles here, the bottom quintile it's very little at all. Okay, I put this one up because I've been asked to do some the GPIs for what are referred to as Gulf cooperation countries. There are about 6 oil-rich countries in the Middle East. I put this one up at Kuwait because you can see here, this is where the per capita GPI went negative, strongly negative. Can anyone tell me why that might have been the case? That's about 1991.
That's Gulf War?
Yes, that's when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and they basically threw everything towards the war effort. In fact, so much that the GDP, in fact, per capita GDP went up. All right, but the per capita GPI, now included in the cost of crime is a cost of homicide. So to capture the loss of lives in a war situation, that's picked up there. So there was a massive increase in the so-called cost of crime, and that's what played a part in that particular value. I was going to put up, that's by quintile. I was going to put up one because I've also done one of Rwanda. Now, in the mid-1990s, you had that period, couple of years of genocide in Rwanda. That also goes strongly negative for a couple of years. And just finally, whether this is all that important, I don't know in terms of the lecture, but I'll talk about it anyway. There's a thing called a Preston curve. Okay, and these blue dots represent combinations of per capita GDP and life expectancy of every country, or virtually every country on Earth. Okay, here's a line of best fit. It's a logarithmic. It's got an R squared of 0.6863. And these red ones, that's about 17 countries where I've done a bit of a crude estimate representing combinations of per capita GPI and average life expectancy. There's the line of best fit. And what I found is that in 14 of the 17 countries, so if you plug in, so into that equation, the per capita GPI of a country, and then into that one, the per capita GDP of a country, the value for life expectancy is closest to the actual life expectancy in 2015 in 14 of the 7 cases. The per capita GPI is more accurate predictor of life expectancy. And that's it. I haven't got the time on me, and I can't see a clock. How much time?
You've got about 8 minutes.
All right, yeah. So questions, definitely. Yeah.
So is the GPI more of an indicator of life expectancy rather than income per capita? So like GDP and income per capita, would you say they're basically the same measurement?
Well, GDP is classed as national income. I could give another lecture on that. It's not really a good measure of national income either, because income is really a measure of the value of the maximum amount you can consume and still be in a position to consume at least the same next year and beyond, and GDP, which means that, well, the question is, could you consume your entire GDP and still be able to consume the same amount next year? Well, of course not. You have to set aside some of your GDP is capital goods to replace worn-out capital goods, and you've got defensive and rehabilitative expenditures and so forth. So, but anyway, that's a different issue. But when you're talking about income in that sense, you're talking about per capita income and per capita GDP.
So like when on the y-axis the US goes down from say 60,000 to 30,000, is
Oh, right. Oh, no, don't. They're completely separate. So the red one was per capita GDP,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah, what's GPI?
per capita GPI, which is, yep.
So is that saying that under GPI now people are earning an equivalent of $20,000?
That's a good point. It's a bit difficult to say. Well, it's not saying that they're earning it. Some people argue that really it's this one that matters. It's the trend change that matters. I mean, what can you say about, in 1970, the per capita GPI being about $20,000? Well, again, that's just going to be the value of the difference between the benefits of what the US was doing in 1970 and what they'd done in the past, and what they were preparing themselves for the future, and the costs. Okay? And this is just a per capita measure, monetary measure of what the US was producing each year. And of course, what you produce doesn't necessarily indicate the full benefits, because some of what you produce is done outside the formal economy, like household labour and the shadow economy. And quite a lot of what is produced by a country is produced for defensive and rehabilitative reasons, so it's not adding to well-being. And some of them are costly. They're costs rather than benefits. Well, of course, in the case of the GPI, the costs are subtracted rather than just added in the case of GDP. Yeah? Yep.
GPI actually has to increase. It's like...
No, it doesn't have to. Well, it didn't here.
Yeah.
And you can see here, well, some of these other countries, well, it fell quite sharply here. It's all over the place. For
You said there's like a baseline GPI.
That's a good point. It's interesting because you can see the per capita GDP above per capita GPI. If I was to put up Rwanda, the per capita GPI is very low, but in fact, for most of the study period, it's above per capita GDP. And the reason for that is that generally we think of the formal economy, okay, stuff captured in national accounts and so forth, and then the informal economy sits on top of it. Well, it's the other way around. Okay, you've got the informal economy and the formal economy sits on top of that. And in countries like Rwanda, okay, the informal economy is very important. So when you hear things like people in country X, say X percent of people in country Y or what have you are living on $1 a day, that's nonsense. They're not living on one. That $1 a day represents $1 of goods and services they're purchasing and consuming from the formal economy. But there's the informal economy. No one could live on just $1 a day and nothing else. They're living on the informal economy. And if your per capita GDP is very low, okay, because there seems to be a minimum value for unpaid household labour in the shadow economy, okay, there seems to be a minimum value. It's around about, can't remember now, it's about $3,000 or $4,000 a person. So you can have countries which have per capita GDP less than $1,000 per person. But the per capita GPI, it doesn't seem, well, apart from we have those negative values, but they're just special cases, generally is around about minimum $3,000 or $4,000 a person. And that consists mainly of the informal economy and the shadow economy and so forth. Yep.
With the whole investment not included in GDP but not GPI, or at least for this year, is that meaning that you include it once the project is finished?
So if you're talking about just capital goods, firms purchasing capital goods, so the machines they purchase this year aren't producing goods and services this year, we'll assume. They're producing goods and services that we consume in the future. Right, so they're not adding to our well-being today, but they're adding to our well-being in the future because they produce consumption goods and that's picked up in the consumption item. Now, as far as infrastructure, like publicly provided infrastructure, again, anything that's being built today is not adding to our welfare today, but it's included in the GDP, that expenditure. But once the project's completed, it's not included in GDP, but we're getting all the benefits from it. So the GPI imputes a service value of completed infrastructure or existing infrastructure. Doesn't add anything for infrastructure as it's being built because it's not adding to our well-being while it's being built.
So once it's finished,
That's when you get the benefits. It's a bit like consumer durables, right? We don't add the value or the benefits from a TV set until, not even when we purchase it do we add it. It's where we wear the thing out. So we get, as I said, a $1,000 television set. We don't get an immediate $1,000 benefit. We get no additional benefit. We take it home and we hook it all up and we turn it on and off over about a 10-year period and it's over that period of time that we enjoy the benefits of it, as we destroy the thing. Okay? Consumption being a necessary evil. All right, so if it's $1,000, say, over a 10-year period, we could say it's about $100 per year over the next 10 years. So it'll be included in the services provided by existing stock of consumer durables. Once it's 10 years, it drops off the existing stock. Okay, so nothing lasts more than 10 years. So when you're calculating the value of the existing stock of consumer durables for this year, it would be what was purchased last year, less what dropped off last year because those goods were completely worn out. It's assumed that they've become waste. Sorry? It's not that difficult, actually. There's a lot of other items are much more difficult to do.
We're going to have to end soon, but I just think there's some questions which haven't been asked, which would be nice to ask. Just for example, the cost of loss of wetlands. Mm-hmm. There's lots of ecological costs which nobody's asked about. Yeah. And which the obvious thing to ask is, how do you go about assessing what they are in monetary terms?
Well, they're the hardest costs of all to calculate, or items of all to calculate. Basically, what you have to do is you start with a physical change in wetlands. So if they've been depleted by so many hectares or whatever, and then you've got to make an assumption as to what the value of a hectare of lost wetlands is, multiply that by the total loss of wetlands, and there is your cost for that year. There are odd studies that you find where people have worked out what the value of a hectare of wetlands is, and you use that for the dollar value, and you can use other data to determine what the change in wetlands is over time. Not an easy thing to do, and it's probably the greatest criticism of the GPI. But my view is that just indicates that we need better methods, better data in a lot of cases. The environmental data is appalling. We seem to have very good economic data because the focus is on economic things, not environmental things. Even the social data at times is pretty poor. But that doesn't mean that the GPI is inherently inadequate. It just means that because of lack of data, the difficulty of calculating the items means that the value that you come up with is not going to be necessarily all that precise. In fact, for this particular study, I'm using World Bank data and other bits and pieces of data. I'm going to be giving a point score for each country because, say, in a country like the USA, the data is very, very good. Okay, so the value I come up with is probably going to be pretty close to the mark. I can't remember Saudi Arabia. It's not as accurate. It's not going to be as accurate. But a lot of people don't realise that per capita GDP, there's a lot of guesswork there as well. They're going to do a lot of modelling to calculate per capita GDP. And so that's not entirely precise. And then they're now also changing the price that they're using to calculate real GDP based on qualitative improvements over time. So there's a lot of subjective judgment valuation that goes into calculating real GDP.
Okay, well, I hope everybody appreciates how important Phil's work is potentially, and that this is the beginning of something. Just as people started developing national income accounts in the 1930s, and there had to be a lot of work and improvements over time, but pioneers had to actually start doing it. Then something similar is happening with the genuine progress and some other measures of well-being which are being developed at the moment. So please join me in thanking Phil for talking with us about
When I took this off, the light was red. What does that mean?
I think
I turned it.
it means it's all right.
Okay, good.